full canopy cover, and when you've got a full canopy cover, what's it like underneath? Pretty open, there's not a lot of understory, right? Yeah, and is that anything like an old forest? No, it's not. So, I studied rough grouse in East Tennessee for my master's, and what kind of forest do rough grouse like to live in? Anybody know?
Dense
Dense where?
on the bottom story.
Yeah, dense down low. So what age forest are we talking about? Yeah, pretty young forests, like 5, 10, 15-year-old forests. So where were all the rough grouse in the Cherokee National Forest? They were in the regenerating clear cuts, right? They like clear cuts. So you often hear people say, oh yeah, well, a lot of wildlife species need those clear cuts. There weren't clear cuts 500 years ago. Where were they then?
Probably like natural forest fires or just natural causes come in and clear the area.
Yeah. Anything that caused trees to go, that punched a hole in the canopy and put sunlight on the forest floor, and stuff started growing back, that young regenerating forest, that's where they were, right? Okay, so why is it that so many forest managers say our forests, when we leave them alone, are not good wildlife habitat, and we need to manage them to create good habitat for wildlife, to create habitat for rough grouse, to create browse for white-tailed deer, to create dense nesting cover for turkeys?
Because you can't guess when something's going to happen to create that habitat for them.
Okay, well, you can't guess when it's going to happen a little bit when you have an 80 to 100-year-old forest. But would that habitat that they're talking about be available if we left that forest alone for another 50 to 100 years?
Yes.
Yeah, but do we want to wait 50 to 100 years for good habitat? Right. So sometimes we hold foresters' feet to the fire when they say, you must manage a forest to have good habitat. That's not true. You don't have to. But when you've got an 80 to 100-year-old forest and you want to put vegetation down on the ground, then punching some holes in the canopy can sure help, right? But if you manage all of your forests, you could say, hey, if we're managing for rough grouse, let's clear cut all of it. Will you ever have the characteristics of an old forest then? No, you never will, right? So I would argue that if we want to manage for all of our wildlife and not just deer and turkey and rough grouse, for example, then we need to set some areas aside. I would argue some pretty damn big ones here and there and let them grow. And we're not going to see those old growth conditions. I'm not going to see them in my lifetime. You might start seeing them when you're old, and your kids will, right? Around those areas, we can manage our forests. We can have young regenerating forests. But for those species that need old stuff, we need to specifically identify where those are going to be and let them go. We can use tools. We've got some wilderness areas. We've got some state and national parks. We don't harvest timber on those, right? So that's good, Then we find out, we look at our maps and figure out, okay, where do we have a big, extensive area of landscape where we don't have any parks or wilderness or whatever, and where would be an appropriate place to put an old forest there? And let's start because it's not going to happen anytime soon. Make sense? I tell you all that because we're going to be visiting with a friend of mine, Damon Hollis, graduated from our wildlife program 25 years ago, went on to Mississippi State and got a master's degree in forestry. Damon followed Jason Maxedon. Jason Maxedon was the first TWRA West Tennessee wildlife forester. And when Jason moved up and out of that position, Damon moved into that position. He's forester for TWRA. He does forestry for wildlife, right? And Damon he was been indoctrinated in the church of silviculture, but he also recognizes that his job is not to make money. his job is to manage timber for wildlife. He and I don't all, I think fundamentally and ultimately we see eye to eye, but we don't always see eye to eye on the exact way to get there. We're gonna visit with Damon on Wednesday. Got a little bit of a drive. We're going to a place I haven't been before. Hart's Mill. Anybody been to Hart's Mill? It's down east of, southeast of Greenfield. So it might be about a 40-minute drive. We got a little bit of a drive to get there, okay? But he's gonna show us a recent harvest. There's some of it clear cut and some of it what he's gonna call thinned. And you know, if you don't worry about the purpose of a thinning or a single tree selection, you can call it whatever you want. You know, if you're not doing it for money, if you're just doing it for wildlife, it could be a thin or it could be a single tree selection. So he's going to show us some thinned trees and maybe some clear cut area and look at it, talk about their purposes and intent and the result and the future of that. That sound okay? Okay. All right. So I think this is where we left off the other day, right? I said 40 trees per acre. That's pretty thin. Is common for good habitat for red-headed woodpeckers. This would be for something about twice as dense. There was a lot of work in past decades to convert a lot of our hardwood forests to pine monocultures, and that's of course horrible for wildlife. Having a pine component is great. It's fine. What are our native pines here in West Tennessee? Loblolly? Not so much. That's more a southern pine that we have planted here in plantations, and it's done very well. But as our climate has gradually changed over the last few decades, we're seeing loblollies volunteer more and more. So I think that their native range has expanded northward, partly due to climate, but exacerbated by human planting. So that's kind of a southern one that's come up here. Yeah. Virginia, yeah, Virginia. White is a more northern one that's been planted for landscaping and Christmas tree farms and some other purposes, sometimes timber. But as our climate has changed, that more northern species is not doing as well down here. So as loblolly is kind of coming up, white pine is kind of withdrawn, okay? But the Virginia pine is a Tennessee species. Shortleaf pine is another common Tennessee species, okay? And pines can often do well on pretty poor soil, on pretty dry and infertile sites. So if we're gonna put them on a slope, which slope should we put them on? Put them on the south slope, because they can grow there a lot better than a lot of our native oaks can. And save our north slope, it's more moist, often more rich for our species that need those conditions, like white oak and stuff, okay? And what do we call the direction of the slope again? North slope, south slope? There you go, now you're talking. Good. Okay. I talked a little bit about soft edges, and I think I talked a little bit in lab the other day about edge feathering. A soft edge is just when you have an edge that's a gradual transition from one habitat, usually a later successional, to another habitat, an early successional. And it can be something as simple as putting in a grass strip, a CRP strip, or some other grass strip between a row crop field and the forest, or between row crop fields. Or if it's pasture, just leaving the outer 2 or 3 or 4 bush hog widths unmowed. I had a little bitty soft edge, 20 feet, around my field. I had all the bidens growing around it, right? And then edge feathering is where and I mentioned this, is where we can cut trees to kind of thin between the more dense forest and the pasture of the row crops. Now this shows those trees have been cut and taken away, and you can do that. You can also just cut them down and leave them, okay? And that, those treetops, brush is going to grow up through them, and those could be quail covey headquarter areas, nesting areas for turkeys, etc. Or what's the other thing I said you could do? Harvest them and sell them. You could cut them down, or what did I say in labs? The other thing you could do. Just kill them standing, right? The sunlight's still gonna get through. There's no more leaves. The sunlight's gonna get through. You still get the benefit, but you'll get the benefit of those trees as snags for a while, and then as logs for a while, right? So you could get potentially more benefit. But feathering is typically where you thin the trees at the edge. Sunlight's going through, you're getting stuff growing up, so it becomes very much more dense. And you have trees and brush and all sorts of stuff. And that's a way to soften it. So we can work on an edge, by working on the woods, or we can work on the edge by working on the field, or some combination of both, right? When I was, 20 or 21, I took a job one summer with the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska, in the Tongass National Forest, the Misty Fjords National Monument. I volunteered on a trail crew for 3 months and lived in a tent with 7 other people. And we would work 8 days on and 4 days off. And one of our 4 days off, we hiked up to an area called Punchbowl Ridge, which way up there, that far north, it was 2,000 feet above the ocean. It was a 2,000-foot cliff. We hiked up the cliffs, we could look out over the ocean, and it was alpine. It was too high for trees to grow up there. There was mountain goats and stuff. And hiking up there, in this national monument that had never been harvested, there were 150, 200 plus, 220, 30, maybe 50-foot tall trees, Sitka spruce and other Douglas fir and other trees that would fall across a ravine with a diameter from the wall to here, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 feet diameter, with moss growing on them several inches thick. And the easiest way to get through that terrain, that mountainous terrain, was to walk along fallen trunks for 50 or 100 feet, like a highway, until you get to another crossing tree, and you can climb up the limbs to get up on top of that tree, because that tree crossed, and this trunk in front of you is 8 feet tall. You get up on top of that one and walk 150 feet along that trunk to the next one, and hop to the next one, and hop along that trunk. And every now and then you look down and you see the ground 40, 50, 60 feet below you. And that was kind of an eye-opener for me. I thought, I thought I'd been in some pretty wild wilderness areas, but that was pretty wild. There were a lot of dead trees. Old growth has a lot of characteristics that make it unique, and you've talked about a lot of them. But one of the things that we didn't talk about very much is that old growth forest has a lot of dead wood. And if you think about a managed forest, a forest where we're harvesting timber, what's happening? Our goal is that we're going to harvest that wood and take it away before it has a chance to die. So there's not much dead wood. And anything that depends on dead wood, from the primary cavity nesters to the secondary cavity nesters that come along behind, to the salamanders, to the decomposers, and everything that eats all that stuff, is gone. One of the main components of old growth forest is dead wood. And when forest managers, even for wildlife who aren't managing for money, say, we need to kill trees, we need to get rid of trees in order to create those old growth conditions. And the way that they're paying for their management is to sell the wood. They're not getting the old growth conditions that are most critical, right? They're selling that component that's so critical to so many species. If we're gonna have an old growth forest, and we're gonna have some managed forests, wouldn't it be cool if that old growth forest could be surrounded by the managed forests, where we do occasional clear cuts, occasional harvest, right? So we don't have this old growth forest right up against urban areas, urban encroachment, suburbia, cattle pastures, right?
we've got this protected old forest area with some forest that's managed that might not have all those characteristics, but it can be as good. And what's really cool is that many of our national parks are surrounded by national forests. And many of our state parks are surrounded by state forests. And that's exactly what happens. In parks, we don't harvest the timber. In the forests, we do. So that's government actually setting up a system that kind of made sense, that kind of worked, which is pretty good. So there's a lot of coarse, woody debris. Okay. You see this every now and then. A tree goes and pulls up the root wad, right? We see it around town when there's a whole lot of rain, and then a storm comes through, right? And the roots are saturated, and you get the root wad. Well, of course, when the root wad comes up, that leaves a hole in the ground, right? A low spot in the ground. And think about this. Think about an area where the forest floor is completely uniform. And what we keep saying, diversity, diversity, diversity is good. What do salamanders like? Salamanders like more moist. A forest floor that's drying out all at about the same rate. The salamanders are looking for something moist. What would be useful to them? Something a little bit lower, right? And in a flood, what would be useful to a lot of species? A little bit of higher ground, right? So this pit and mound topography that naturally occurs in some old growth forests over time here and there, that's one more thing. It's not a critical component. It's not like an old growth forest always has it and it has to have it, but it's an example of the types of things that add to the structural diversity of a forest that makes it better for maybe a couple more species of salamander or a couple more species of frog or some bird that we don't know about that benefits from that in ways we never imagined, right? Diversity is good in every possible way. Jack Ward Thomas. I think he's probably retired now, but he was a biologist, a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service back in the 1970s and 80s in northeastern Oregon, near my study area in Oregon. And he studied forest management for wildlife, and he went on to become the first director of the U.S. Forest Service who was trained not as a timber manager, but as a wildlife biologist, which was cool. That went on, I think he was president of the Wildlife Society. He's won our highest award, the Aldo Leopold Award. But back in the 1970s and 80s, he worked with several other folks to write a book on managing forests for wildlife in northeastern Oregon. And it's kind of been used all over the country as a model. They looked a lot at dead wood and standing snags and cavity trees. Now, it's going to be different wherever you go because every area has different species of woodpecker, assemblages of woodpecker. But where they were, they said it's good to provide for every species of woodpecker and therefore every species of secondary cavity nesters that depend on those woodpeckers, at least 6 to 8 cavity trees per acre, at least 4 snags per acre that's at least 6 inches DBH. And they said for any 10-acre area, you want 5 snags, that's 1 snag every 2 acres, that's at least 18 inches in diameter for the big, woodpecker? Affiliated, right. 15 snags that were at least 14 inches, 25 snags that were at least 6 inches because a downy can make a nest in about anything, right? And he said put them in groups of 2 or 3, sometimes groupings because they like foraging areas. You know, they like a lot of snags together so they don't have to fly too far to go from one spot to another. And keep in mind that woodpeckers make a new cavity every year as part of their mating ritual. They form annual pair bonds, and part of that bonding process is making a cavity together. So it's not like, okay, I've got my cavities, I got my woodpeckers nesting there, I'm good. No, because next year they're gonna have to make a new one somewhere else. So you can't just manage in stasis. You have to be growing new forest all the time, growing new snags all the time, recruiting new snags. That's to say, trees need to be dying at a regular rate. And that's not gonna happen naturally unless you have enough trees
big enough trees to die. And if you're taking half the trees out of the system, then you don't have enough trees to recruit more snags, right? I'm sounding like an anti-forester here. I'm not. I recognize that I benefit from forestry, and forestry can benefit wildlife and humans in all sorts of ways. I'm just saying, if what wildlife are adapted to is forests with half the trees and a hell of a lot more coarse woody debris. Coarse woody debris. CWD. That's the other definition, CWD. Coarse woody debris. Dead wood. Okay? So this is for the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon, but the general idea is good, is that you want to be recruiting a bunch of little snags and a few medium-sized snags and a few big snags, and to some degree in bunches all the time in a good, active, dynamic forest. Good. Now here's fun. This is fun. Creating snags. Well, you can let it happen naturally, but if you don't want to wait another 50 years for a bunch of trees to die, there's a few ways that you can help some along, right? One of the more common ways is girdling the tree. It's easy, it's cheap, it doesn't kill the tree very quickly, and it doesn't always kill the tree. And this is where you can just take a saw or a hatchet and just cut in the cambium layer all the way around the tree, about a 3-inch ring. And if you do 2 cuts, one above the other, that works even better to kill the tree. But one of the problems with this is that the tree doesn't rot properly. The best rot for woodpeckers is heart rot, okay? And that's when the tree rots from the middle. And the idea is that they punch a hole through the tough, outer portion of the tree, which is hard to do, and they get into that punky interior. And it's easy to pull a bunch of stuff out of that punky interior, right? So they got a cavity. If it's rotten on the outside and solid on the inside, they peck and the outside just falls apart, and it's really hard to get anything out of the interior. They can't make a cavity very easily, right? So heart rot is a really good thing, and this tends to cause it to rot from the outside in. So that's not great, but it still makes good foraging anyway, so just not the best for cavities. These days we use inoculation a lot, hack and squirt. It's easier, it's faster, it's more expensive because you're using herbicides. It's more effective, it tends to rot right. We can actually use something like an inoculant to inoculate not just a herbicide, but heart rot bacteria into the tree. Now that's more expensive as well, but sometimes they do that in large natural areas out west. We have to be careful because a lot of those herbicides, well, not only are they expensive, they last a long time and they're active. So if it rains, that'll get into the ground, it'll move across the ground, it'll kill a bunch of other trees. I've done it myself a fair bit. It's amazing how many other trees it'll kill over months and months. But it does rot right if you're just really careful, and that can be very effective. You can go up into a tree 30, 40, 50, 60 feet, and you can cut the top out with a saw. You need an experienced, expert sawyer to do that, right? And some trees that won't kill them. So you can cut it with a saw and then hit it with herbicide on top, right? And it's expensive to hire somebody to do that slow, dangerous thing. It does rot properly, but what works even best, okay, guys, I'm gonna tell you this next part, but nobody's heard of this in the southeastern United States, okay? And if you recommend to a landowner that they blow the tops out of their trees with explosives, please don't tell them that you got that from me, because they'll think you're stupid and that I'm stupid, okay? But there's been a lot of research on this, there's been a bit of research on this in the Pacific Northwest, and this works very effectively. You go 60 feet up into a Douglas fir, drill a hole in the middle, shove a thing of dynamite in there, and blow the top out of that tree, and the top is jagged, and water sits in there, and heart rot bacteria gets in there, and it works very effectively to kill that tree, and it rots properly. You have to have permits, and it's dangerous. But if you like pyrotechnics, go out west and ask about that. But don't suggest to anybody around here that we do that, because we're about 40 years behind the Western United States.
I mean, You can buy a tannerite up there at Rural King. I mean, it's separated, and when you put it together, when it turns into an explosive. But
Fun research project. That'd be a fun NRM 330 project. Garrett's like, dang, that was boring. Why did I go up with that one? Okay. So, not only do we need to be constantly recruiting trees because woodpeckers make a new cavity all the time, every year, but because different species use different decay classes of cavities. You might have one species that's using a live tree for roosting, a stage 3 dead tree for foraging, and maybe a stage 8 down material for nesting. Who knows what, right? And of all the dozens of species of birds and mammals and herpetofauna, all of these different stages are being used by lots of different species for different things. So again, you can't just create a bunch of snags this year and walk away. You need to have a forest that's dynamically, regularly recruiting snags, or that is to say, trees are regularly dying. And when most people think, oh, we got a problem, trees are dying left and right. Well, if they're dying faster than new trees are being recruited, that might not be a good thing. But if they're just dying as a course of natural life and death in a forest, that's a good, healthy forest. You're creating fantastic conditions for life by providing a whole lot of death. Am I shifting your paradigm just a little? I hope I am, okay? And I asked the other day, where does a bluebird nest? It nests in that dead tree, but not that dead tree, not that dead tree, or that one, or that one. It nests over here in these dead trees, right? And where do you get these dead trees from? Well, if you're managing your forest, you get them in a clear cut, but you have to leave a few trees in your clear cut to die. If you cut everything, you're going to have to put up bluebird boxes, right? So, in a natural forest, you would have a disturbance that would maybe kill a whole bunch of trees, but it wouldn't kill every single one. So we have all different decay classes happening all the time, and you have them happening in different evolutionary stages. And you want all of it. You want all of it. And the more of it you have, the more diversity of structural conditions you're providing for everybody. You think we know everybody's story? You think we know everything that a cerulean warbler needs? Or that a Swainson's thrush needs? We don't. So what's the best way we can provide for all those dozens of species? Provide the most diverse historical conditions, mimic the most diverse historical conditions we can. So if you do cut trees, you can leave the tops, you can leave the limbs, leave slash, especially on steeper slopes to slow or control erosion. We can, if some people don't like leaving it everywhere, so they'll use earth moving equipment to windrow it, to put it in long linear piles along edges. Okay, you can do that. Leaves and twigs should not be pushed off into streams. Large logs in streams is usually okay, as long as you don't overdo it. That's structure. But leaves and twigs in streams, just like anything else, grass or anything else, decomposes, pulls oxygen, and that's a bad thing. Brush piles are fine if you're going to create brush piles. Bigger logs on the bottom, finer stuff on top. Those bigger logs, cracks in between them, animals will use those. And realize that they'll break down, so you keep on adding to them periodically. Just as those snags have all these different decay classes, so do logs. And logs occurring in different successional stages is good too. Did I tell you guys about my postdoc research? No? So my doctoral research was blue grouse, winter ecology. My postdoc research was blue grouse nesting ecology. So a bunch of female blue grouse, put radios on them, followed them around. And I didn't have a huge sample size, but I had exactly half of the females that nested underneath a log that was suspended above the ground, either by branches or contour or some combination there. It was a few inches above the ground, like
6 to 15 inches above the ground. They nest right underneath. The other half, exactly half, nested somewhere else, under a bush, in a clump of grass, beside a tree, whatever, okay? Of those that nested somewhere else, exactly 50% of them successfully hatched at least one egg. Of those that nested under a log, exactly 100% of them hatched at least one egg. Logs are good. Fire suppression over the last several decades in that area has resulted in lower recruitment of logs. And when the fires do come through, they burn hotter and more severe, and instead of killing trees and leaving them standing, they incinerate them and leave them ash, right? So we don't have as many logs like this as we used to on that area because of our forest management practices. And by returning the natural fire return intervals, you'll have more cool spotty fires, you'll have more recruitment of dead wood, more logs, more happy grouse nesting. Yay. All right, streams. Stream buffers are good, right? All sorts of names we have for stream buffers, riparian buffers. What does SMZ stand for? Streamside Management Zone. That's right. A general rule of thumb is for a stream that drains at least 50 square miles, you want 300 feet on either side of the stream in forested buffer. That's a football field, right? And it's also recommended that the first third of it closest to the stream be left alone, not harvested at all. And if you want to do some harvest of some of it, that outer 2/3 of it, farther away from the stream, can be harvested. And as you get into bigger streams, you need those buffer zones to be wider, right? Who's heard of the Strehler stream ordering system? Who's heard of first, second, third, and fourth order streams? Okay, all right. This is a common way of kind of measuring or gauging, providing an index of stream size, okay? So a headwater, a stream, that first comes out of the ground, would be considered a first order stream. So here's a couple of headwaters, a couple of first order streams. Where two first order streams come together, here and here, you have second order streams. Where two second order streams come together, you have a third order stream. For two third order, you have a fourth order stream, big river, right? Mississippi River. So that's, when you hear people talk about first order streams, be thinking about a little trickle, a headwater where you got salamanders and maybe brook trout if you're up in East Tennessee, right? The second order stream, okay, maybe it's a big enough creek for some rock bass, maybe some smallmouth, and then third, fourth order streams. Now we're getting to the big catfish and the things. There's often roads through woods, and we need that. We use that. We're going to have that, but it's a good idea to seed them quickly. I'm talking about like logging roads or access roads that we might not gravel, so we can seed them very quickly. Often things like native grasses, even white clover and such, some legumes. These can serve as travel corridors for wildlife, foraging areas for galliforms, for turkeys, quail, grouse. Best not to put these right along streams. You look at all the roads, and for example, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and most of them are right along streams because that was the easiest place to put a road. Where should you not put a road? Right next to the stream, right? So that we did the easiest thing, but it was the worst stuff. We shouldn't make roads too steep along the contour. They should hopefully follow the contour, but not right along the stream. My study area in Oregon, the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, had several areas of that forest had 5 kilometers of road per square kilometer. So in a square kilometer, there'd be 5 roads along. Just lots of logging roads and ranching access roads, and that's a lot more than we want. You can daylight roads. If you've got a road, let's say this road is going east and west, okay? No, sorry, north and south. Okay, that's heading south. That's south, that's north, right? And that's what this road is doing. It's going north and south, right? And let's say that it's such a narrow road that the canopy is still pretty full. Sunlight's not getting through. So I can't really grow anything down on the ground here, right?
if I want to daylight this road, to put sunlight on the road sides, which side should I cut a few trees or kill a few trees on? The left or the right? Wait. I didn't say that right. This is not going north and south. This is going east and west.
So,
Yeah, you cut the trees on the south side, right? Because the sun is south of us, and that sunlight will come through and hit the road, right? So you can cut trees down, you can girdle them, you can inoculate them. What's the term that a lot of people use for inoculate? Hack and squirt. That's jargon. Everybody uses it, but it's jargon. In this class, I'd like for you to use inoculate. Okay. Later, you can use hack and squirt. But follow best management practices. Those refer not just to how we manage our streams, but roads as well. Sometimes you'll run across woodland openings, old home sites, old rock walls. Sometimes those can be created. Food plots can be put in. Those roads can be used for that purpose. Old home sites that have apple trees or pear trees, fruit trees that have old wells or cisterns. Those all in a large extensive forest can provide just a little bit of diversity, an opportunity to have vegetation down on the ground, and it's always okay to work with that and take advantage of those opportunities. A lot of old ponds that were created for livestock watering are often available, abandoned. Those are often filling in. They're too small for fish, so that makes them great for amphibians, for frogs and salamanders and stuff. So that's great. I've got one in the woods in front of my house that frogs go crazy. Anybody spend any time in Cumberland Plateau or East Tennessee where you've seen, Piper has, bluffs and rock houses and that sort of thing? This is pretty common in some parts of the world. You can actually go to southern Illinois and Missouri over here and see it as well, right? And this is actually really good habitat for some species of, some unique species of plants, some species of herpetofauna. Some of them have caves that have cave-dwelling species. Spotted skunks use rock houses a good deal. Some species of birds nest on these cliffs. So it's always good to not mess with these areas, not harvest timber around these areas. Just let these areas be as natural as they are, because they are somewhat. I mean, they're not extremely rare all the time, but they are somewhat rare across the ecosystem. So good. Where we have karst topography, karst, K-A-R-S-T, means cave-ridden topography, caves and sinkholes. We often have bats, and where people have gone into these caves and disturbed the bats and moved around Geomyces destructans and white nose syndrome, that's caused problems. So where we have endangered bats, in some cases, our state wildlife agencies have partnered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and nonprofit groups like the Nature Conservancy and BCI, that's Bat Conservation International, to work with private landowners or public agencies who manage these caves to put up gates to keep people out. In a perfect world, we could keep people out without these gates. But where we can't, this is often what we resort to. Now, we've done a lot of research and two endangered species of bats in Tennessee are the Indiana bat and the gray bat. We also have the northern long-eared now. I don't know about that one. But the Indiana bat can easily fly through these slats right here, okay? And what we have is right here a couple slats that are locked in place, and you can go around behind us real hard with a lock and key and unlock these and take those two slats out and crawl through if you need to get in there. But an Indiana bat can go through those slats, but a gray bat is not comfortable with something like that. It needs a bigger area. So what they come up with is a chute. And so that humans can't easily get into it, they usually put the chutes up pretty high, so you have to use a ladder or something to get to it. And then they do things like smear petroleum or tar on it, so that when if you try to climb it, it's a mess. And I hear some ecologists say they want to make the edges really sharp, so that people cut themselves. I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that, but we do want to discourage people from getting up into that chute. So this works for the Indiana bat. If the cave also has gray bats, then you have to do the added expense of doing that right there. This is Roy Powers. He's kind of a pioneer in Bat Conservation International, who's built dozens, because each one of these has to be designed independently, and this is heavy duty metal, and they go and welded into place, so it's a lot of work. And he's designed and led a lot of those efforts for bat caves around Tennessee and the Southeast. So my brother is I think we're getting, is that our last slide? Is this our last slide? Yeah, this is our last slide. We've got 3 minutes, good. My brother's an endangered species biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Cookeville for the Ecological Services Field Office for the state of Tennessee. He took these photographs. The one on the left is in Tennessee, the one on the right is in Kentucky. First of all, let's be clear. Coal mining, the way it's done today, surface mining, strip mining, mountaintop removal mining, you can't do that without seriously impacting the environment. Let's just be clear about that, okay? 17 federally endangered species of fish in Tennessee. Got 3 more minutes. Whatever is here runs off into our streams and rivers. So let's be clear. We can mitigate all we want to, all right? But it's a significant impact. Now, this photograph he took of an old mountaintop removal strip mine in East Tennessee. The whole area was clear cut. The area in the foreground was part of the mountaintop removal strip mine. And it was revegetated and grown back. The area in the back was clear cut, but it was not part of the mine. So that and that grew back all at the same time. Okay. What you see is a difference in the quality of the soil due to strip mining. Okay. So mining impacts soil. Where we have the elk viewing tower over above La Follette, Tennessee, over north of Knoxville, on the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area. It's a place called Hatfield Knob. It's a ridgetop, a mountaintop. That's an old mountaintop removal mine. It was a couple hundred feet higher once upon a time, and it's a field now. It's pasture. In its field, it's pasture. It's grass, partly because the soil is very poor and trees won't easily grow there. So they took advantage. They made that liability into an asset. They weren't growing trees, they weren't growing canopy, but they were putting grass on the ground that was enough for the elk to eat in a forested region. So that's what that was all about. Good. So, point being, where mining goes on, we often have to compromise and work with those people doing the mining. The North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area is a grand example of collaborative efforts. The trees are owned by timber companies on a good bit of the North Cumberland WMA. The minerals are owned by mining companies on part of the North Cumberland WMA. The surface of the ground is owned by Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. So what we have is a bunch of conservation easements that allowed us to acquire enough land to put elk back on the ground, right? But we don't own rights to manage every characteristic of that land. That's the price we paid to get that many acres up there. Makes sense? Good? Useful? A little bit? Okay, cool. You got a question, Gary? No? Okay, it's fine. Y'all have a good one. Be ready to hit the field.